My name is Marcus, and during my time working as a freelance private investigator, I quickly learned that the most terrifying cases aren't the ones involving professional criminals or calculated corporate syndicates. The cases that truly keep you awake at night are the ones that involve ordinary, everyday people who develop a sudden, completely unhinged fixation on a total stranger. This second case from my files is a chilling testament to that reality. It is a story about a young woman who found her peaceful life completely upended by an invisible predator, and it serves as a stark reminder of how vulnerable we truly are in our daily routines. To ensure her complete safety and maintain her legal anonymity, I will refer to her in this account by the pseudonym of Amanda. Amanda was a quiet, fiercely independent 24-year-old woman who lived alone in a modest, beautifully kept rental cottage located on the rural outskirts of a scenic town in upstate New York. She was an avid nature lover and worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, a profession that allowed her to enjoy the isolation and natural beauty of her surroundings. Her cottage was nestled directly against the edge of a vast, dense state forest conservation area. For Amanda, this location had initially felt like an absolute paradise. Her daily routine was deeply tied to the natural world. Every single morning, before sitting down at her computer to work, she would lace up her hiking boots and take her golden retriever, a loyal and energetic dog named Buster, for a long, peaceful walk along the winding dirt trails that cut through the ancient timberland behind her property. For nearly 2 years, Amanda's life followed this tranquil, predictable rhythm. She knew the trails like the back of her hand, and Buster enjoyed the freedom of running through the thick underbrush. However, as the autumn season began to transition into the harsh, bitter cold of early winter, the comforting atmosphere of the woods underwent a subtle, deeply unsettling change. It started on a Tuesday morning in late November. The air was crisp, and a thick, low-hanging mist was rolling through the bare trees. Amanda was walking her usual path, about a mile deep into the woods, when Buster suddenly froze in his tracks. The dog's ears perked up, his tail dropped between his legs, and a low, menacing growl began to vibrate deep within his chest. Amanda stopped, looking down at her pet in surprise. Buster was normally an incredibly friendly, gentle dog who rarely barked, even at wild animals like deer or foxes. Amanda scanned the surrounding woods, squinting through the dense gray fog. The forest was entirely still, the silence heavy and absolute. But as her eyes moved across a thick ridge of pine trees about 50 yards away, she caught a sudden flash of movement. Standing perfectly still behind the thick trunk of an old oak tree was the distinct silhouette of a man. He was dressed entirely in dark, heavy winter clothing, and his face was completely obscured by a thick hood. What sent an immediate shiver of unease down Amanda's spine was his posture. He wasn't hiking, he wasn't gathering firewood, and he didn't have the gear of a local hunter. He was standing completely motionless, his body positioned squarely toward her, staring directly at her through the trees. The moment Amanda made direct eye contact with the distant figure, an intense wave of vulnerability washed over her. Feeling her heart take a sudden leap in her chest, she tightly gripped Buster's leash, turned on her heel, and walked briskly back toward the safety of her cottage, constantly looking over her shoulder to ensure they weren't being followed. When she reached her house, she locked the doors, pulled the curtains shut, and tried to dismiss the encounter using practical logic. She told herself that the woods were public land, and it was entirely possible that the man was simply a local resident enjoying a morning walk who happened to pause in that exact spot. But the next morning, the comforting illusion of a coincidence was completely shattered. Amanda set out on her walk at her usual time, hopping to shake off the lingering anxiety from the previous day. She deliberately chose a completely different trail, one that cut through a northern section of the forest closer to the main road. Yet when she reached a small clearing near an old wooden footbridge, Buster froze once again, his body tense, a fierce growl erupting from his throat. Amanda's breath caught in her throat. She looked across the clearing, And there, standing behind a dense thicket of kikar bushes, was the exact same man in the dark hooded jacket. He had moved with her. He was standing in the exact same rigid, unblinking posture, watching her with a terrifying, silent intensity. Panic fully set in. Amanda didn't walk this time. She broke into a frantic run, dragging Buster alongside her until they burst through the tree line into her backyard. She slammed her heavy wooden back door shut, threw every security bolt, and sat on the kitchen floor, her chest heaving as she tried to process the horrifying reality. This wasn't a random encounter. The man was actively tracking her, learning her schedule, and waiting for her in the deep isolation of the forest. The harassment quickly escalated, moving from the cover of the woods directly onto her private property. Over the next 2 weeks, Amanda's life transformed into a psychological nightmare. She stopped walking in the woods entirely, keeping Buster confined to a small fenced area in the yard. But the watcher did not back off. In the dead of night, when the rural landscape was swallowed by an absolute, pitch-black silence, Amanda would wake up to the distinct, terrifying sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching slowly over the gravel driveway outside her bedroom window. Whenever she summoned the courage to turn on her phone torch and peer through the blinds, she would catch a fleeting glimpse of a dark, hooded figure retreating slowly into the shadow of the tree line. On 3 separate occasions, she found deeply disturbing physical evidence left behind on her property. There were deep, heavy boot prints pressed into the soft mud directly beneath her living room window, indicating that someone had been standing there for hours, pressing their face close to the glass to watch her move inside her home. Terrified and feeling completely isolated, Amanda contacted the local county sheriff's department. 2 deputies arrived at her cottage, walked the perimeter, and documented the footprints in the mud. However, they explained the harsh, frustrating reality of the legal system. Without a physical identity, a license plate number, or clear, definitive proof of an explicit threat, their hands were legally tied. They couldn't station a patrol car outside her remote cottage indefinitely. And they advised her to invest in a security system and keep her doors locked. Feeling completely abandoned by the authorities and sensing that the predator was growing bolder with every passing night, Amanda realized she needed a professional who could operate outside the standard limitations of police routine. She needed someone who could actively hunt for the truth. She looked up specialized investigative agencies and contacted me. When Amanda sat in my office and recounted her story, her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely hold her glass of water. The confident, peaceful life she had built in her cottage had been entirely stripped away, replaced by a raw, fragile state of perpetual fear. She looked at me with tears welling in her eyes and whispered, "Marcus, I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I can't sleep, I can't work, and every time the wind moves the trees outside, I think he's coming for me. Please, you have to find out who this is." I looked at the photos of the footprints she had taken, noted the layout of her remote property against the vast state forest, and officially took her on as a client. I knew this case was a ticking time bomb. The stalker was operating with a high level of confidence, using the isolation of the wilderness as a shield. My objective was clear. I had to insert myself into that quiet rural landscape, set up a covert counter-surveillance operation, and unmask the invisible predator before his obsession turned physical. To begin the operation, I knew that traditional static surveillance inside a parked car would be completely useless on a remote rural property bordered by thousands of acres of dense state forest. A stalker hiding in the thick timber would instantly spot a strange vehicle idling on the gravel road. I had to become as invisible as the predator himself. I traveled to Amanda's cottage during the middle of the day, packing heavy equipment hidden inside ordinary cardboard boxes to avoid drawing any attention from looking eyes. My plan relied heavily on technology. Instead of sitting on the property myself and risking exposure, I deployed a series of high-end, weatherproof trail cameras and tactical night vision security units. I spent hours deep in the freezing woods, carefully climbing trees, and concealing the motion-activated cameras high up on the trunks of old oak and pine trees. I positioned them to cover every single blind spot around Amanda's cottage: the perimeter of the backyard fence, the long gravel driveway, the soft mud directly beneath her bedroom window, and the main entry points of the dirt trails where the hooded man had first materialized. These cameras were equipped with infrared technology, meaning they could capture crystal-clear, high-definition photographs and video clips in total darkness, without emitting any visible flash or light that would tip off an intruder. All the data was encrypted and routed directly to a secure receiver inside my office, allowing me to monitor the property remotely in real time. For the first 48 hours, the wilderness remained completely silent. The cameras captured nothing but the swaying of bare tree branches in the winter wind and the occasional movement of local wildlife, like deer passing through the brush. But on the third night, just as the clock ticked past 2:30 a.m., my remote alarm system triggered. One of the Deepwoods cameras had detected motion. I opened the feed on my monitor, and a chill went down my spine. Emerging from the dense fog of the state forest was the exact figure Amanda had described. He was dressed entirely in dark, heavy winter layers, his head covered by a thick hood, and a dark scarf wrapped tightly around the lower half of his face, leaving only his eyes exposed. He moved with an unsettling, fluid confidence, completely familiar with the terrain. The camera captured him stepping over the brush, walking slowly toward the edge of Amanda's property. He approached the backyard fence, stood perfectly still for nearly 20 minutes staring at the dark house, and then slowly walked along the perimeter, checking the windows from a distance before melting back into the shadows of the woods. He was a ghost, but now I had his digital footprint. Over the next 2 nights, the pattern repeated with clockwork precision. The man would emerge from the exact same section of the state forest at almost the exact same hour. By analyzing the timestamps and the specific angles of his approach, I was able to narrow down his entry path. He wasn't arriving from the main road, nor was he parking a vehicle anywhere near the cottage. He was hiking in from a deeper, interior network of trails, which suggested he either lived nearby or was parking his car at a remote public trailhead located about 2 miles north through the conservation area. With a definitive pattern established, I decided it was time for a direct physical intervention. I couldn't rely solely on the cameras anymore. I needed to identify this man before he grew bold enough to attempt enforced entry into the cottage. On a bitter, freezing Thursday night, I drove to the area hours before his usual arrival time. I parked my vehicle a mile away, covered it with brush, and hiked into the woods on foot, navigating entirely in the dark without a flashlight to avoid detection. I positioned myself inside a dense thicket of pine trees, about 30 yards from the trail camera that had captured his initial movements. Wrapped in heavy thermal gear, holding a high-resolution camera with a night vision lens, I sat perfectly still in the freezing cold, blending into the winter landscape, waiting for the clock to strike 2. The silence of the winter forest was absolute, broken only by the occasional distant hoot of an owl. The cold felt like needles pressing against my skin, but I maintained my position, keeping my eyes fixed on the gray mist of the trail. At exactly 2:41 a.m., the crunch of frozen leaves broke the quiet. I raised my camera, looking through the green-hued digital viewfinder. Out of the darkness, the hooded figure appeared, walking with that same slow, calculated pace. He was heading straight toward Amanda's backyard line. As he passed within 20 feet of my hidden position, I began firing a rapid sequence of high-speed digital photographs. The infrared illuminator on my equipment lit up his face perfectly through the lens. Even though the scarf covered his nose and mouth, the hood had shifted slightly in the wind, exposing a clear, high-definition view of his forehead, his eyes, the distinct structure of his eyebrows, and a prominent, jagged scar running down the side of his left temple. I tracked him as he walked to the edge of the yard, watched him repeat his terrifying ritual of staring at Amanda's dark bedroom window, and then documented his retreat. The moment he disappeared back into the deep woods, I quietly packed my gear and hiked back to my vehicle. I had the evidence. The next morning, I sat in my office and ran the crystal-clear images of the stalker's face through several private investigator databases, local public records, and cross-referenced the distinct facial scar with regional criminal registries. Within 3 hours, the mask was completely ripped away. The invisible predator was a 31-year-old man named Dennis, who lived in a small residential neighborhood just 3 miles away from Amanda's cottage. But the most disturbing revelation came when I looked into his background and history. Dennis wasn't a stranger to the local legal system. He had a prior criminal record involving multiple arrests for criminal trespass, prowling, and voyeurism. 2 years prior, he had been convicted of stalking a woman in a neighboring county, using the exact same tactics, tracking her schedules, lurking in the shadows outside her windows at night, and using public parks as a staging ground for his obsession. He was a serial predator, a deeply unstable individual whose dangerous behavior was actively escalating. I immediately called Amanda and instructed her to lock her doors and stay inside with Buster. I then took the complete, comprehensive file, the trail camera footage, the timestamps, the night vision photos showing Dennis standing on her private property, and his verified criminal history, and walked directly into the county sheriff's headquarters. When the lead detective reviewed the file I placed on his desk, his demeanor changed instantly. The vague, unsubstantiated complaints Amanda had previously filed were now backed by undeniable, high-resolution physical evidence collected by a licensed investigator. The detective recognized Dennis's name and the scar from his previous file. With the photographic proof showing Dennis actively violating private property boundaries in the dead of night, the sheriff's department had all the legal probable cause they needed. Within 4 hours, a judge signed an emergency arrest warrant for criminal stalking, cyber prowling, and criminal trespass. That very afternoon, 2 marked police cruisers pulled into Dennis's driveway. The deputies caught him completely by surprise, arresting him in his front yard before he could even attempt to flee or destroy the digital evidence on his phone. When the police searched Dennis's residence following his arrest, they uncovered a terrifying hoard of evidence that showed just how close Amanda had come to a physical tragedy. In his bedroom, detectives found a wall completely covered in long-range surveillance photographs of Amanda. There were photos of her hiking in the woods, images of her sitting at her desk, and detailed handwritten logs documenting her daily schedules, the exact time she left her house, and the layout of the locks on her cottage doors. Most chillingly, they discovered a backpack packed with heavy tools, zip ties, and duct tape sitting right next to his bed. Dennis was formally prosecuted, and given his prior criminal record and the overwhelming weight of the evidence we had compiled, he was sentenced to a substantial prison term. Amanda was finally safe. The heavy, invisible golden cage that had surrounded her cottage for months had been completely dismantled. A few weeks after the trial, she decided to pack up her belongings and move away from the remote rural edge of the forest, relocating to a secure residential neighborhood closer to the city center. She kept Buster by her side, and slowly, over many months, the raw, fragile state of fear faded away, replaced by the return of her peace of mind. For me, the case was a stark, permanent reminder of the grim realities of my profession. It showed that the vast, beautiful wilderness can easily be weaponized by an obsessed mind, and that sometimes, the only thing standing between an innocent target and a terrible tragedy is the willingness to watch the shadows and unmask the predator before it is too late.